Now welcome Kusar Samli to moderate our panel discussion.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. So we've heard from three wonderful voices about some of the critical issues that surround many of the topics that we've been talking about. And what I'd like to do is we'll start with a brief intro and some quick comments from the speakers, but then really we want this to be a conversation. So I'll pause deliberately to just ask for questions as we go through the next 18 or so minutes that remain. So we have with us today, as some of you may have heard, Chris is a technical writer. He's a former developer turned into a technical writer and blogger, giving a voice to many issues pertaining to technology and society and social impact. We have Purvi, who is an attorney by training and has been working diligently on how do you transform the way that legal professionals approach law and practice law in a manner that has significant societal impact. And as part of that, she helped co-found Law for Black Lives. And then we have Bridget, who joins us as a professor from UCSD, and just shared with you a brief overview on some of the work that she's been doing on AI and the challenges faced with regards to how does law keep up, or how can law keep up with the rapid changes that happen with technological growth. With that, let's dive right into it, and with a quick starter question for Purvi and, of course, everybody else as well. You talked a lot about many of the challenges that you've identified and the experiences that you went through and some of the disillusionment. And out of that, you shared like three gold nuggets of sort. And the second one was identify the right problem. Could you share a little bit about your approach on how do we go about identifying the right problem? What does it take to recognize, realize, and find the right stakeholders? And that now's the time to invest in maybe creating a movement or achieving critical mass?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and one that I think I get asked by a lot of young lawyers who are also thinking about, how do we figure this out? I think there are a couple of things that I've learned along the way. One is something my mentor used to call running to the fire. How do you actually look for where people are hurting the most and actually show up in those spaces? But the second part of that is how do you go without an agenda? And that's the part that's hard for us, is that we want to go with our next big idea, with our, but this is going to solve these problems. And so a lot of what I think schooled me as a young lawyer was the process and the humility to just observe and participate. And to really hear, what are people saying is hurting them? When I started out as a young lawyer, I thought I thought the issue that was impacting the local community that I was working in was welfare. And when we went to their community meetings, they said our issue is actually tenant issues. And so it's like, how do you actually shift and adapt based on what people are identifying as their problems? The second thing I'll say is sometimes we know the problem, right? Sometimes you don't need a huge investigation, or you're not locally rooted, right? And that's, I think, a challenge. And I think it's good to think about, do any of our projects have local roots? But I think if they don't and you know the problem, right, how do you actually take the time to map the field, right? And I think this is what happens is like people won't adopt the technology if they don't trust who made it. And there's a lot of distrust right now, as we can see. So I think it's slowing down, mapping the field, and not doing that in a transactional way, in a way it's like, this is my competitive advantage, and fine, do all that because you need to, but how do you not have a transactional relationship with people who are actually suffering the deepest impact from many of these problems?
Thank you so much. You brought up several issues in the things that you just mentioned, and a theme that I noticed in each of your three talks, which was centered around humility, that coming back to facing these realities so that we can approach them from a perspective of humility and step away and step back from the arrogance that has often become quite evident. What I'd like to ask is, Chris, particularly since you transitioned from a role of technology development in the context of being a developer to one who is giving voice to a lot of these things, and you raised this topic first, can you share a little bit around, what are the actual ground reality things that we can do to kind of freshen our perspective a bit, to step back and reapproach things from a much more humble point of view and step away from that arrogance and this almost predominant view of let's go save the world. Well, maybe saving the world begins in our backyard.
I mean, from my perspective, is nothing that is particularly clever or new. Just maybe just more in my space, telling people that you should go out and meet real people and meet your users and things like that is fairly. It's the only time I've ever been interrupted by a ship horn. Is a fairly obvious thing to say. So I guess the points towards the end of the presentation were about trying to find the right people to convince those people that these are things they should care about is more the issue. And I have found some of those who are somewhere in the middle, and they kind of interact enough with the more technical people to get them to care about other stuff apart from just code. Mm-hmm. And more people from this community and communities like it that want things to change in a more positive way. I think that's the only piece of advice right now that I can say that I think would work, and I think hasn't been said before.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely, thank you. And as a follow-up on this topic, Bridget, one of the things that I'm curious about is that you brought up and very aptly pinpointed that there's a huge challenge, almost a dissonance between the rapid pace of technological change and the inability for government and our legal systems to catch up. How do we bridge that? Can you share a little bit more about some very specific ways on being able to do that, particularly maybe incorporating some of the things that Purvi and Chris shared about that as well?
Sure. Well, I think, again, as I said, I think there are a lot more questions and answers at this point. But from a beginning standpoint, I do think we do need to bring in the people that are impacted, and they need to be having a voice. Those are the voices that we should be hearing from at a policy level about what is the potential impact and how can it impact the end user, and how can we develop a policy that can really protect those individuals and listen to those voices as opposed to those who stand to gain profit or lose profit, depending on how you end up regulating the issue.
Great. I'll pause here for a moment. We have about 10 minutes, and I'd like to certainly open up the floor for questions. So, yes, right here.
Yes, yeah. Gabriela, question. We do address this as always being against something that has been decided. What about becoming proactive in order to do the reglementation for the AI? What about having an initiative where people have a voice to say what they want, what not want? It is a paradox that we are in here today saying that we have the freedom to do whatever we want. However, we don't have the courage or we don't have the voice to say whatever we want. So I address all of you the question, how can you make people to be more proactive, or where are you proactive towards all the matter talked? Thank you.
I mean, I can offer one piece, which is, Robin Kelley, who is an African-American scholar in the US, says something about finding the strength to love and dream. I think, a lot of people are living in circumstances in which they don't have the luxury to dream about a future world. It's all about survival. And so I think part of this is and it's a huge thing that I learned from this space, I think people are dreaming, and we cannot quite build the world we believe in if we cannot imagine it. So I think part of it is figuring out, folks in this world have figured out how to dream. And some of that may come from privilege and the insulation from the hard realities a lot of people live with. But you've also learned how to structure that approach, and you have methodology that allows you to move beyond what seems, possible right here. And I think this to me is why that creative collisions, it's how do we make spaces where people with different blind spots and different dreams can actually put those together and we can see, because I don't think it's just people don't want to be proactive, but there's a lot of things that are challenging people's ability to just survive right now. And it's very difficult in those moments of crisis to do the jujitsu that's required to say, let me not just try to preserve my basic status quo. How do I actually dream for something that feels impossible? So I think it's about recognizing the different lived realities that people have, and then helping create the space for all of us to dream. And I'll tell you, a lot of the clients that I work with, whether they're in prison, whether they are in the streets, they have dreams. They very much know what the world is that they want to live in. But frankly, no one really cares what their dreams are, and some of us don't either. So how do we make more space for their dreams? And frankly, they'd probably mirror a lot of our dreams as well, but they're sort of more invisible.
That's true.
Kind of answering one bit of your question in a very different way is, I think one of the areas I like to, this is actually kind of what I do more as a day job, what actually pays the bills for me, is there's a whole wealth of open source projects, software projects that are behind a lot of the AI systems and blockchain projects and all these things that are being discussed here. And to be blunt, if there's a commercial one, there's probably an open source one. And granted, just because it's open source doesn't mean you can understand it and interact with it, but through education and through positive kind of education of its existing community, you can get them to explain themselves better so people from outside of the community can interact with it and be more proactive. And secondly, and this is the kind of work I do, actually despite sometimes the outside perspective, view of some of these projects, as I kind of discussed with tech people, they're actually screaming out for people to do documentation, explanation, community work, etc., to bring more input into those. And that's kind of where you can really get proactive at the starting point of where problems may come from, maybe, on the technical level, I suppose.
Those are the only thing I would add, just from a very practical standpoint, is on the policy level, you can get the government to hold hearings about things, and so that's a strategy that we are working on at my center right now, just at the California state level, but at least things can be replicated once you've started it. And so having public hearings and bringing people that are impacted, digging into the communities, talking to people who are impacted, and then bringing those people as the witnesses instead of just the typical lawyers or the typical lobbyists, to really bring some emotion and some true reality to the impact, I think is the first step. It's a very, it's a systemic issue that's not going to be addressed that way overnight. But at least bringing those people to the table is a start.
Thank you. Any other questions at this point? Yes.
Hi, hello, I'm Michael. I have a question, Purvi, that was prompted by something that you said, but that seems to be kind of in the ether, and it's very concrete to us in this room. Something you said is this conference is all about helping folks, helping refugees, helping those who are less fortunate, and they're not really in the room. And so my question is, how does that change what the conference looks like? In other words, if we want to welcome these different cultures and different voices into the room, what does that mean for the kinds of spaces that we convene? And I'm sort of curious, because I think it relates to some of the other issues that you're discussing. So I'm really curious, in your opinions,
Sure.
what that could look like.
It probably looks like more time, translation, interpretation. It looks like, needing to have a lot of resources going to get those people into the room, because I certainly, am not as impacted as other people. There's no way I could be here unless someone paid my entire way to get here. So I think you have to look at where the resources are going, but I think you're getting at a bigger question, which is like, what's the culture of this space? And I think there has to be space before we spend so much time on the what. What are we doing? What am I doing? Here's my pitch. Here's my hustle. Let me tell you my big idea. Invest in it. And if you really want to move at the speed of trust, then I think you have to start with stories, right? And I think that's actually your work. And I found that I organized a hack in Miami that brought together entrepreneurs, technologists, creatives, lawyers, organizers, and directly impacted people, taxi drivers, public housing residents. First day of our hack was just stories, and frankly, only the stories of the people that were living the realities. And then we made them in our teams, they were the expert. I heard someone else say today, I forget what it was like someone has lived reality, but they're not the expert, right? How do we flip those paradigms? People don't want to be in these spaces because they don't speak, I have a lot of higher education, and I'm a pretty confident person, and I have been struggling to understand different things that people are talking about. There's tons of acronyms. So it's like thinking about what is our purpose? What are we trying to accomplish? If it's connectivity, relationships, collaborative problem solving, then the entire nature of it shifts. And that might mean you still need a space like this, right? It doesn't mean every space has to become that. And we've done, in law, like we have trade talk. We need to have some spaces where we can go deep on our own strategy, but how do you create an alternate space for the collaborative problem-solving work, and in which the culture of that is co-designed. It's not sort of, build a steering committee in which those different types of people are designing the space for what works for their constituency.
Hello. Yes. I have a quick comment to Bridget first. In terms of regulation and technology, I think one of the main challenges is that technology is a sprinter in terms of development, and regulation is a marathon runner in terms of regulating problems. And oftentimes, a lot of regulation often comes after the problems arises. So I think that we have to live with the fact that we really don't know how the regulation will be, because we don't know what kind of problems will arise from the new technologies that are being developed constantly. So,
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the biggest challenge for sure. But I do think that it's possible to envision, to use the word disruptive, everyone's favorite word today, but to envision the way that technology is disrupting our current existing infrastructure, at least as it comes to licensing and regulation in that very specific space, and to adapt at least some types of principles where you are protecting people and the end user, and implementing, at least just at a very minimal level, some level of assurance of that this technology is going to work, and that if it does provide harm, what is the level of liability? I mean, that's just like the very basic level. It has to be flexible enough that it can evolve over time, and it's going to have to. But you're right. I mean, if we wait until the technology is here, so like an example that I've used in California, we have, Uber and Lyft is, like the ride-sharing technology, and it came and it just took off. Everyone has it. And then the news starts hitting that people are being sexually assaulted by their drivers, and then the regulator is like, oh, wait, you need to have background checks for your drivers. Well, the toothpaste is well out of the tube by that point. And so I don't think it would have been so hard to envision something like that happening in advance if you're really thinking through what the impact of this technology would be. But typically the way that the legislatures function, the world functions, is that they wait for this. It's like a very reactive approach. So if we do take some time on the front end to think about the end user and the potential damage that the technology can cause, you can do these regulations at least on a minimal level in advance.
Can I add one very quick thing to that? Actually, one thing you said in your talk wasn't completely correct. There are actually code of ethics for engineers. This is where this weird argument between what's the difference between a developer and an engineer comes from. But computer engineers actually do have to go through ethics courses, but there's no comeuppance to it. You don't get struck off like a doctor or anything like that. And maybe if they were better informed and enforced from the outset, that might be something to think about.
That's a good point.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. Do you have a
second
follow-up question?
I have a second question to Purvi. First of all, a very, very good presentation that you made. And so I've never experienced being a person of color in America. But one observation that I have made when I've seen the discussions that you have had with the Black Lives Matter movement is that when you look at the data of how many people are being killed by the police in America, it is only the result is comparable to authoritarian countries, right? No other democratic countries you find that the police kills the citizens in the same rate that they do in America. So I think it's, of course, there's racism in it. I will never argue against that. But a lot of white people as well is being killed by the police in America also. So I think it's more of a question, how do law enforcement, or how do you look at punishment, and how do you look at the police's role in the society? So I think it's even more fundamental than just to discuss racism, because if you just discuss racism, then you will... then you won't get to the root or the root core of the problem?
The one thing I'll say is that the American system of law enforcement came out of chattel slavery, which was explicitly the enslavement of African people in America. And the idea of the modern idea of police came out of slave patrols. So we actually can trace a very strong line around American policing to a very a racist and a chattel slavery system, right? And that might be a uniquely American brand. Although we're seeing now policing is a global project. You have the IDF in Israel is teaching the NYPD how to use tear gas. We're using the same products created. So I think you're right to say that policing and our understanding of what is the role of police and what is the role of police in a society, right? I think that's a good thing to interrogate. I would say how we formed a culture around that is actually deeply rooted in a racist origin story of America. So I think it's a yes and.
With that, we're out of time. So thank you so much for your comments and questions. Please join me in thanking the
Thank you as well. You're an amazing.
Yeah.